For days, the pattern looked almost one-sided. Shadow moved. Kaydee followed. He landed in a familiar tree and she appeared nearby. He left, and sometimes she left seconds later. On one afternoon, friends of Big Bear Valley timed the gap at just 2 seconds. Then on August 23, it happened again. 2 seconds. Again. If that were the whole story, the headline would be easy. Kaydee would not stop following Shadow. But then Shadow made a move that changes how we have to read everything that came before it. Because Kaydee was no longer simply trailing a resident eagle through Big Bear. She was standing in the nest, moving large sticks, while Shadow remained close enough to watch. And in the published images from that day, the two were eventually shown working around the same nest material together. That does not prove a pair bond. It does something more useful. It forces us to ask whether this association is still being driven mainly by Kaydee, or whether Shadow is beginning to participate in it too. That is the question hidden inside all those flights. Who is choosing whom? And the answer is not as obvious as it first appears. Go back to the beginning of August. Friends of Big Bear Valley reported that a nearly mature banded eagle had appeared around the habitat. On August 6th, the group began documenting the banded subadult that would later be identified as KD1, the eagle now called Kaydee. At that stage, the behavior did not look like a developing partnership. One early encounter described by FOBBV was almost the opposite. Shadow was perched on the lookout snag. A nearly mature banded eagle joined him. Shadow left in less than 30 seconds. The visitor waited roughly a minute and headed out in the same direction. That moment is important because it gives us a baseline. The distance between these birds was not always small. Shadow did not begin August acting as though a new eagle had simply been invited into every part of his routine. The cameras were recording a visitor entering an established territory. And outside the breeding season, that alone is not extraordinary. Field biologist Jenna Carpenter told CBS Los Angeles that young adult eagles can come to Big Bear simply because it offers good habitat and food. At that time of year, she explained they are not necessarily thinking about breeding. A productive lake, tall trees, familiar perch sites, and access to food can attract eagles without any romantic explanation at all. Pete Bloom, the raptor biologist who helped band Kaydee, later added another layer. He told the Los Angeles Times that around 4 years of age, many raptors begin prospecting. They explore established eagle territories looking for vacancies and opportunities. In his explanation, territory can matter before mate choice, because a good territory is what makes successful breeding possible in the first place. That possibility changes the meaning of following. Imagine Kaydee not as an eagle chasing Shadow, but as a young adult gathering information. Where does the resident male perch? Where does he roost? Where is the nest? Where are the productive feeding areas? What parts of the habitat does he use repeatedly? A resident eagle can be a moving map of the territory. That does not mean this is what Kaydee was consciously thinking. We cannot know that. But it gives us a biological alternative to the human story that she simply wanted to be close to him. And for the first several days, that alternative fit the evidence very well. Kaydee appeared in places Shadow already knew. She explored, she watched, she moved through the habitat. Then something began to shift. On August 10, Kaydee made her first observed visit to the Big Bear nest. That was a major change in location, but not yet proof of anything more. Bald eagles can visit nests outside a confirmed breeding relationship. Friends of Big Bear Valley repeatedly warned viewers not to declare a new pair before the season, and the behavior justified it. Then, August 13th brought another step. Shadow returned to the nest after his previous visit on July 23rd. Kaydee was not far behind. Again, the movement direction was easy to notice. Shadow first, Kaydee after him. Inside the nest, however, Kaydee did more than stand around. She moved sticks. Published reporting later described her also nibbling or preening Shadow behavior that Pete Bloom would identify as relevant to the possible formation of a pair bond. But at that point, friends of Big Bear Valley remained cautious. A new bond could be forming, or it might not be. The organization said the more meaningful test would come later when the calendar moved toward the fall and winter breeding period. Then came August 14, and this is where the simple Kaydee follows Shadow story begins to crack. Kaydee was already perched on the twin pines. Shadow arrived later. He flew to the tree where she was. FOBBV reported that he joined her on the same branch before moving to a lower branch, and the two spent several hours in the tree. Read that sequence carefully. For once, Kaydee was not the eagle closing the distance. Shadow was. That does not mean he had chosen her as a mate, but it is a counterexample to the idea that every close encounter existed only because Kaydee kept pursuing him. And once one counterexample appears, we have to start tracking direction more carefully. Who arrives first? Who approaches? Who leaves? Who follows? Who stays? That is where the next few days became so interesting. On August 18th, before sunrise, friends of Big Bear Valley heard Shadow and Kaydee vocalizing through the valley. The organization described a lively morning exchange but refused to label it as proof of a deeper bond. The next day produced one of the clearest movement sequences so far. Shadow flew into the twin pines. Less than a minute later, Kaydee joined him. They perched on different branches for roughly 3 hours. Then Shadow left. Kaydee followed 2 seconds later. That number exploded because it feels precise. 2 seconds sounds intentional. 2 seconds sounds coordinated. 2 seconds sounds like a rule. But there is no scientific 2-second rule for bald eagle pair bonding. The number only matters because it gives us a measurable observation. Shadow departed. Kaydee departed almost immediately afterward. The value comes from repetition. Later that evening, cameras found them again in a favored roost tree. Kaydee briefly went to the nest and then returned to the roost area. They vocalized as the day ended. By then, Kaydee 1 had been given the name Kaydee. Friends of Big Bear Valley usually waits longer before naming visitors. This time, the organization made an exception and named her whether or not she ultimately stayed. That decision did not change her biological status. It changed ours. Now the visitor had become a recognizable individual in a continuing sequence of observations. And once that happened, every new movement could be compared with the previous one. August 21st added more evidence that Kaydee was learning and repeatedly using Shadow's familiar landscape. She appeared around the roost tree, the cactus snag, the twin pines, and the nest area. Then August 23 delivered the repetition everyone noticed. Shadow and Kaydee began the morning together around the roost, greeting the day with vocalizations. Kaydee went to the nest while Shadow appeared to remain behind. Later, Shadow was seen at the lookout snag. Kaydee was nearby around the cactus snag. Shadow left. Kaydee followed 2 seconds later. A second 2-second departure. Now we had a pattern strong enough to ask a better question. Not does 2 seconds prove they are a pair, it does not. The better question is, why does Kaydee keep matching Shadow's movement so quickly, and is Shadow beginning to match hers too? That second half is where the story changes. Because later on, August 23, the nest itself became the center of the action. USA Today published a sequence of images sourced from Friends of Big Bear Valley footage showing Kaydee and Shadow together in the nest. Kaydee handled a large stick. Shadow watched. Another image showed both eagles moving sticks in the same nest. Then the interaction became more complicated. Kaydee appeared to nibble near Shadow's beak. Shadow reacted. They faced each other. A later frame showed Kaydee close to him again. The close contact moment attracted most of the attention. But for this story, the more important image may be the stick work. Why? Because it changes the direction of participation. Kaydee was not simply flying behind Shadow. She was doing something in the nest, and Shadow was there participating in the same space. Pete Bloom had already told the Los Angeles Times that moving sticks and nibbling were behaviors that could assist in the formation of a pair bond. Based on the broader pattern, he said it was highly likely the two would be a pair when nesting begins, which he placed roughly around December. That is the strongest expert interpretation we have so far, but it still needs a counterweight. Friends of Big Bear Valley has not treated every shared perch call or stick movement as confirmation, and there is a good reason. Late summer is a permissive time for eagle movement and social tolerance compared with the more consequential nesting period. Young adults roam. Good habitat attracts visitors. A resident male and a prospecting eagle can spend time near each other without the future being decided. Kaydee is also only about 4.5 years old. Federal wildlife guidance says bald eagles generally reach full adult plumage around 4 to 5 years. That makes her old enough to be approaching maturity, but it does not create a deadline. Age is context, not destiny. So we have two explanations running side by side. One says Kaydee may be prospecting a valuable territory and using Shadow's movements as information. The other says the repeated proximity, shared roosting nest activity, close contact, and expert interpretation are beginning to look like early pair formation. Those explanations are not mutually exclusive, and that may be the midpoint payoff. Kaydee could have come to Big Bear because of the territory and still develop a bond with Shadow after arriving. In fact, Bloom's explanation makes that sequence biologically sensible. Territory first, mate second. The lake food nest perches and established eagle habitat may have made Big Bear worth investigating. Shadow may be becoming part of the reason she remains. Now look again at all the following behavior. If Kaydee were only following Shadow because he knew the territory, that behavior might be strongest, while she is still learning the landscape. If a social bond is developing, we would expect the story eventually to become more reciprocal. Not necessarily perfectly synchronized, not every day. But over time, the initiative should stop looking entirely one-directional, and we already have hints of that. August 14, Shadow flew to Kaydee's tree. August 23, the two occupied the nest together and moved sticks. Those are not final answers. They are exactly the kind of state changes that matter because they prevent us from describing Kaydee as simply a follower. There is one more reason to be cautious about reading pursuit into every flight. The cameras do not show every second of an eagle's day. They show selected views around the nest and important perch trees. If two birds disappear in the same direction, one may be following the other, or both may be heading toward the same food source, thermal shoreline, or familiar perch. The only responsible way to strengthen an interpretation is repetition across different contexts. That is exactly what makes the Big Bear sequence useful. Kaydee has not merely left after Shadow once. She has appeared after him at the Twin Pines, remained in the same tree for hours, shared a roost area, reappeared near him on later mornings, and repeated the 2-second departure on August 23. At the same time, Shadow has not simply fled every time she appears. He has stayed, joined her tree, shared the nest, and remained present through at least some of her nest work. The combination is more informative than any single chase. It also helps to separate access from acceptance. Kaydee has clearly gained access to places that matter in Shadow's daily routine. The Twin Pines, the roost tree, the cactus snag area, the lookout snag vicinity, and the nest itself. Access tells us Shadow is not excluding her from the entire landscape. Acceptance of a future pair bond is a much higher bar. That would require the seasonal pattern to keep developing as nesting approaches. In other words, the story has already moved beyond stranger seen nearby, but it has not yet reached confirmed partner. That middle ground is where the most valuable observations are happening now. The next question is whether Shadow's participation grows. That is what his next move really changed. It changed the investigation. Before the evidence could be summarized as Kaydee repeatedly entering Shadow's orbit. Now we have to track whether Shadow is beginning to enter hers. There is an emotional layer to this that cannot be ignored, but it also cannot be allowed to rewrite the biology. Jackie Shadow's longtime mate died in August after more than 3 weeks of intensive veterinary care at the Ojai Raptor Center. Her death followed a serious medical crisis that included severe anemia and other abnormalities documented by wildlife professionals. For people who watched Jackie and Shadow for years, the speed of the new observations has been difficult. 1 week the community was grieving. The next, another eagle was standing in familiar trees and touching familiar sticks. It can feel like a story is moving too fast, but wild animals do not pause their lives to give human observers time to reorganize their emotions. Federal wildlife materials note that bald eagles can accept a new partner after a mate dies or disappears. That does not mean Shadow has accepted Kaydee. It means the possibility itself is normal eagle biology. The timing may feel shocking to us without being biologically shocking to them. And that is why the motion data matters so much. It gives us something concrete to watch instead of projecting a human timetable onto the birds. Less than 1 minute. 3 hours in the same tree. 2 seconds. A shared roost. Another 2 seconds. A nest visit. Stick movement. A close contact. A retreat. Then more shared space. Those are observations. The meaning comes from how they connect. And there is another complication we cannot ignore. Shadow's behavior toward Kaydee has not been uniformly welcoming. The August 23 images show visible tension during close beak contact. Shadow reacted and appeared to set a boundary. That matters because reciprocity is not the same as constant acceptance. An eagle can choose to share a tree and still move away from a particular touch. It can remain in the same territory and still control distance. It can work around the same nest without every interaction looking peaceful. So if you are waiting for one magical moment when Shadow suddenly accepts Kaydee, the cameras may never give you something that simple. The shift may happen by accumulation. One more approach, one more shared perch, one more morning call, one more return to the nest, and crucially more moments when Shadow initiates rather than merely tolerates. And because this is a live-streamed wild territory rather than a controlled experiment, we should expect ambiguity. Wind, camera angle, off-camera movement, and simple coincidence can all hide or exaggerate patterns. That is why the strongest evidence will come from repeated choices visible across many days, not from one perfectly timed clip. That is the next test. Imagine 2 possible futures. In the first, Kaydee keeps following Shadow through September and October, but Shadow rarely approaches her, rarely remains during nest work, and increasingly keeps distance as the breeding season approaches. That would weaken the idea of a growing mutual bond. In the second, Shadow begins repeatedly joining Kaydee, bringing or moving nest material, while she is present, roosting near her, vocalizing with her, and choosing proximity even when she did not follow him there first. That would change the evidence substantially. Not because any one behavior is magic, because direction would become reciprocal. The strongest relationships in field observation are not built from a single viral clip. They emerge as behavior becomes repeatable and coordinated over time. Federal bald eagle monitoring guidance reflects that logic. Biologists assess nest occupancy and reproductive status from combinations of behaviors such as adult presence, nest repair, incubation eggs, and young. No single late summer stick movement carries the weight that the same behavior might carry later in the breeding cycle. Context changes meaning. August is a clue. Winter will be a test. But even before winter, there is one metric we can follow without inventing a story. Initiative. The next time Shadow and Kaydee appear in different trees, watch which eagle closes the distance. The next time one enters the nest, watch whether the other joins. The next time Shadow flies, do not just count the seconds until Kaydee follows. Wait for the reverse. What happens when Kaydee leaves first? What happens when she chooses a perch? Does Shadow ever follow her? Does he arrive later and stay? Does he participate in nest work? She began. Those moments would tell us more than another repetition of the behavior we already know. Because Kaydee has already shown us that she is willing to move through Shadow's world. The unanswered question is how much Shadow will move through hers. And this is why the August 23 nest event matters more than the dramatic 2-second chase. The 2-second follow told us Kaydee was still tracking Shadow's movements. The nest event told us the relationship could no longer be described only in that direction. Shadow was present in the same core space. He engaged around the same nest. The interaction included both cooperation and tension. That complexity is exactly what we should expect from an association that is still forming or still being tested. Pete Bloom's assessment raises the stakes because an expert familiar with Kaydee believes the current pattern is already meaningful. Friends of Big Bear Valley's caution keeps the conclusion honest because the real breeding season is still ahead. Put those together, and the answer becomes clear. Kaydee's repeated following is significant because it has persisted across days, perches, roosts, and departures. But Shadow's next moves are now more important than hers. If he begins to initiate proximity consistently, the story changes from a young eagle repeatedly entering a resident male's territory to two eagles increasingly choosing the same spaces. We are not there yet, but the camera has given us the first reason to watch for it. So the next time Kaydee flies 2 seconds behind Shadow, notice it. Then forget the stopwatch. Watch what Shadow does when she gets there. Because the future of this story may not be decided by how quickly Kaydee follows him. It may be decided by the first day Shadow starts following her.